We'd like to welcome you to another It's a Grand Life. And our guest back for a second appearance here on It's a Grand Life is Dr. Julie Braciszewski from Monarch Behavioral Health here in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. We really enjoyed our time with her last time talking about the necessity of scientific-based psychological services where the main focus is having life-changing outcomes for the patients and early and appropriate diagnosis and treatment. And Dr. Julie, we'd just like to welcome you back. Thanks so much for coming.
Well, thank you so much for having me again.
Well, I know kids are very close to your heart, and in your specialty, you have seen an explosion in the increase of anxiety in children. And for our grandparents here at It's a Grand Life, what can they do, and what have you seen as far as you're in and out of the schools all the time? What has that been like to see it up close and personal?
Yeah, I think when we kind of zoom out to that satellite view and we're looking at almost like the topography of the last several years, we can say anxiety and difficulties with mood were increasing before the pandemic. Then we saw this during the initial kind of phase of the pandemic, this kind of retraction from life and kids were home from school. And we actually saw a little decline in difficulty and then a steep incline. And so during the pandemic and now after the pandemic, we are seeing sharp increase in anxiety and depression and mood difficulties. And just like you said, when I'm working with families, but also out in the community, in community agencies and schools, I'm hearing that consistently. We also do some teacher trainings here where we go in and we do professional development. One is on educating from a trauma-based framework. And when I'm doing those trainings, I'm hearing, wow, we have a lot of kids that are presenting and learning like kids that have experienced trauma. But I ask them, there doesn't seem to be a trauma history. And so that the intense anxiety experience and all the mood correlates that go along with it, a sharp increase. Absolutely.
And you do a lot of work with ACEs as well, adverse childhood experiences, and
Yes.
those. And so are you saying that the post-COVID trauma that you're seeing with kids at the elementary and high school, middle school level is similar to the ACEs, even though they may not have had a specific traumatic event that is that what you're kind of getting at?
Yeah, well, what we're seeing is that some of things that will qualify as that adverse childhood event, the ACE or ACEs, would actually, because of the stress and the strain that COVID put on families and parents and grandparents, many children experienced adverse childhood events during the pandemic, whether it was loss of a parent or grandparent or auntie or due to COVID, unfortunately, because school is one of the first front line of social services. And so when kids that were in high risk environments were then removed from school, kind of those high risk environments or situations weren't identified as quickly. And so some kiddos were in really bad situation and environments and kind of the interventions weren't there as quickly as they normally would have been. We also have some kiddos, of course, that were feeling depressed or anxious before COVID, and then all of the stress and fear and anxiety with COVID and disruption to academics, and of course, disruption to being around their peers, really amped all of that anxiety and mood difficulties up. And it is interesting in this kind of, I don't know if we're post-COVID, neo-COVID, I don't know what to call it, but this place we're in now, where we find ourselves,
right.
The majority of people are not wearing masks. People have kind of resumed their routines in daily life, but we still find that the socialization patterns of kiddos is still different compared to pre-pandemic. Not as like high schoolers and aren't quite socializing in the same way that they used to, and same with elementary, middle school age kids. And it is interesting. Certainly another kind of branch to go on is the phenomena of increasing social media use, and that clearly affects kiddos' mental health. And kiddos kind of dove into that even more deeply during the pandemic, and how that's affecting them kind of longer term now, we just don't know. but
we don't have the data yet, right?
Yes. Well, and we do have some data, and ooh, it is scary about how social media affects kiddos' mental health. And so that's also in the equation for sure.
Well, if you are one of our grandparents at home and you were able to chat directly with them, and they're nodding their heads saying, "Oh yeah, my grandchild is having a tough time with social interaction, and they're behind in their reading, and don't get me started about math, and they're on their iPad all the time." What would you say to them?
Yeah, you're not alone. You are not alone, and it's great that you are doing this podcast to create this community for people to know they are not alone in this. There are so many kiddos that, even kiddos that really weren't struggling before the pandemic, that are continuing to struggle.
Right.
We kind of, and maybe on a daily basis, we have this like, well, the pandemic's over, like there's no more effects of it. And we just know that's not true. And so if you're kind of throwing your hands up in the air and feeling frustrated, and my kid is really still struggling in school, or struggling with social interactions, or like their mood seems really low, or they're really, really anxious, certainly get support for it. It might not be, as we often say with parenting, like a phase that they're going through. If we're seeing a kiddo is anxious or having mood troubles for more than about like a week or 2 or 10 days, like, and we can identify there's been a pretty substantial change, or they're looking real irritable, because anxiety doesn't always look like fear. Not at all. It's fight or flight. And so sassy kids, those like really outrageous behaviors, oftentimes the root of it is actually anxiety. So if you're seeing those things happen for 10, 14 days, you don't have to wait. And actually, just like any other type of intervention for kiddos and adults for anxiety, it's faster when we get it earlier on, just like any other health related issue. Absolutely.
So the earlier diagnosis, the more likelihood of a more positive outcome, right?
And sometimes kiddos and adults don't even quite meet like the threshold or criteria for a diagnosis. They're having life stress or something, we call adjustment disorder, and technically that's a diagnosis, but to something that occurred, and we're having a behavioral or emotional reaction to that event. But oftentimes people come in because they're having difficulty coping, having difficulty with adaptive behaviors, and it might not even meet a diagnostic criteria or threshold, but we can certainly still be helpful in that space as well.
So you can give them some life skills and how to deal with that situation.
Yeah.
Did you find in this post-COVID world that these grandkids that are being raised in these grand families who are already dealing with abandonment, was that exacerbated at all during this process? How do you address that?
I think with the disruption of any relationships and routines. And so, for instance, kiddos that might have attachment or abandonment issues and struggles to, honestly, it breaks my heart that like, what was it, March 23rd or something, when it was like, okay, we're not going to school. For those kiddos who all of a sudden were taken away from their teachers and all of their friends, that is a huge disruption in attachment. The caregivers in our lives, certainly grandparents and aunts and uncles, but also teachers, and the important teachers that we trust are our caregivers. And so to have all of a sudden this huge rift and disruption, and then of course our buddies and our friends, and we find safety with them and connection, and to not be able to see friends for months and months. This really, especially for kiddos with attachment issues and challenges. Oh my gosh, yes. That would be incredibly stressful and distressing.
So if you are one of our listeners and you're dealing with that type of situation, what should we do? What would you recommend that they do?
I mean, I think cognitive behavioral therapy for those emotional and behavioral patterns. So a kiddo is developing the insight and awareness of of how relationships work and how they feel and how other people feel. And then, so having that increased insight, age appropriate, because it's different with a 4-year-old than a 14-year-old, of course, but that age appropriate insight that is kind of done in this neutral, safe space of kind of the therapy room. And then learning some regulation skills. When somebody is, let's say, going on a family, let's say my buddy is going on a family vacation, and then I'm feeling really anxious and really angry, but I don't really understand why, that they're leaving for a week. And a kid can have a really big reaction to that. And us adults on the outside are like, what? Are you kidding me? They will be back Thursday. Like, they're like, get in line with reality. But their reality is that they're leaving. And at some ages, kids can't conceptualize Thursday. So this feels forever. And it feels the depth of despair and grief. And it can be really intense. So to help that kiddo learn, and when you feel like this, you will do these 3 things. This is your plan. And we make them really visual and really concrete. And then the grandparents walk through those steps with them and do the identification of the emotion and then the coping plan. And in that way, it helps the kiddo feel safe and secure and connected. And they know there are people that will come and will go in my life, and that's the course of things, and that's okay. That relationship stays within me.
And that's just normal, that folks come in and out of their lives. But before I let you go, I want to ask you about the use of social media, or the interaction with social media with young folks today, and how that's being abused. And do you have any recommendations for the grand families that are listening today?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have some programming around that. And so anybody who's listening from anywhere, all over the US, the world, wherever, go on our social media, on our Instagram page, Facebook, obviously our website. If you do the contact form on our website, you can sign up for our newsletter, so that we hold events in Metro Detroit in person and also over Zoom. And one of them we have done this past year, and we're going to do again, and probably again and again and again, is managing social media. We have one at younger ages and one for teenage ages. So as parents, caregivers, grandparents, managing our kids, accessing all of this information, it is overwhelming. Absolutely. And like anything else in life, our kiddos have to be trained on how to use this. If we think like at school, they have library class, they quite literally learn how to go into a library of information, seek the information and get it. We do have to do that with social media too. And so if we are still at that age and have the opportunity to use guided social media, so some apps that have really limited capabilities, and on a weekly or every other week basis, reviewing the chats with your kids so they know what they are saying, you're going to see it and you guys will talk about it. And if there are things that might seem rude or unkind, or if somebody is saying something that is rude or unkind to them, how they can spot it and keep themselves kind of emotionally separate. So kind of how to engage in social media and chatting like that and texting. We have to have really concrete and clear rules around what is safe and what is unsafe. And we quite literally make very concrete lists. We encourage parents, especially at young ages, screens are only used in public areas, no screens in bedrooms or bathrooms. Creating that boundary early on and just making that like the norm is super important. The amount of time a kid is on social media really matters. And so if a kiddo is on social media, creating spaces and times where there are no screens. So like when you're eating, no screens while eating is a good one. Obviously no bathroom. Kids get real feisty about the bedroom thing because they'll be like, oh, my friends, have their Switch in their bedroom, whatever. Right. But that's a really important one in that screens in bedrooms really disrupt sleep quality. And so it's a little different than like the emotional impact of social media, but the emotional impact and behavioral impact of sleep disruption is profound. So we say no screens in bedrooms, but and screens in public spaces in the home is really a good boundary to have. Really going through pretty concretely, we don't send pictures in bathing suits or underwear or without clothes on, and using very clear and concrete language, nothing that is shadowed or shaded, because kids really need a very clear delineation. And in fact, when we put those boundaries on, kids feel safer and their anxiety drops. So that's really good. It's important to educate on, there's a lot of junk on social media, and this is how social media makes people feel oftentimes. And when a kiddo is like been on Instagram, or is like been left out of a Snapchat group, at checking in about how they feel, and then following up, and what can you do about it? Do you want to get that app off of your phone for a while? You can always download it again. Why don't we see what it feels like to not have Snapchat for a week? That's great.
Julie, you have all this information on your website or part of your newsletter as well, and you have different.
So we have a lot of information and blogs on our website. Okay. It is under the events and resources, and then there's a little tab called insights and resources. And then the blog is in there. Upcoming events, we usually have listed our upcoming events in that tab as well. And we always release it on kind of all of, ironically, our social media platforms, right? Of course. And so we always put that on Instagram and link to like a registration, so we have a good sense of how many people are going to be there. The tips on social media, I don't think we have, because we've done those in presentations and kind of seminars and forums and discussions. Yeah. I don't think we have that information loaded onto our website yet, but I think Dr. Jessica or Dr. Jessie will be writing a blog on that later this summer. So people can look out for that. Absolutely.
And I think that's absolutely great. I think if you had the time, maybe we could come back and just spend time just diving into this, because I think this is really what parents and grandparents are concerned about. And I know it's close to our heart.
It's close to my heart. I have 2 girls. Yeah. And full disclosure, I've been very restrictive. One part in that I'm not ready for them to be exposed to all of that, but also feeling overwhelmed with managing it. And so I've kind of held off as long as possible in that, oh gosh, this is a lot to manage as a parent. And so absolutely, it's close to my heart too. And full disclosure, I'm sure taking a deep dive into it is motivated one part by the research that is very clear that the more time kids are on social media, the more it impacts their mood and anxiety negatively. I know I'm motivated by that, but I know I'm motivated by my own kiddos and the kiddos I see at this practice as well.
Right. And again, you're right in the schools, you're dealing with the teachers, you're dealing with the educators, you're dealing with the administrators and the students, as well as your excellent team does the same thing. This is this is hands-on, boots on the ground information. It's not something you read while you're in grad school. Right? This is real life.
When I was in graduate school, social media wasn't a thing. Like that was right. Yeah. I surprise myself on how old I actually am sometimes. I look back and I'm like, oh yeah, that was a long time ago. Yeah, social media was not a thing when I was in grad school. It is very boots on the ground.
Right, exactly. But I remember having phones with cords on them in the car. So that's going way back. But we just thank you so much for being our guest here on It's a Grand Life. Our guest has been Dr. Julie Braciszewski. She's from Monarch Behavioral Health in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. She's got information for you, whether you're in Michigan or whether you're from around the country. Please visit their website. You're going to find more than you could imagine there at www.mbh-mi.com. Or if you want to chat with Dr. Julie directly, 248-220-3332. Thank you so much for being our guest again on It's a Grand Life. And we're going to have you on real soon to do a real deep dive into the world of social media. Dr. Julie, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us for another It's a Grand Life. Remember to never waste your pain. God can use your situation to bless others even halfway around the world. Be sure and subscribe to It's a Grand Life on our Facebook page, as well as YouTube and any of the various podcast channels that feature the Grand Life podcast. When it comes to raising a grand family, remember the words of the Apostle Paul, who said in 1 Corinthians 13, love is patient, love is kind, it always protects, always trusts, always hopes, and always perseveres. Love never fails. In leading your grand family, it's going to take faith, hope, and a whole lot of love. Please reach out to me. I can be a blessing to you and pray for you, or help you connect to free resources that can make your journey a little easier.